In a charged morning at the Oregon State Tribunal, where law intertwines with legacy, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Clint Eastwood, the enduring icon of American cinema, now 94, found himself handcuffed in the heart of the courtroom. Yet, this tale goes far beyond a mere legal proceeding. It is a riveting confrontation between institutional authority and the dignity of a cultural giant, between the quiet force of jurisprudence and the unflinching cry of liberty. Just when it seemed the gavel had spoken its final word, Pam Bondi entered the chamber, prompted by reports suggesting that the case against Eastwood was nothing less than a veiled assault on free expression, a blow to the First Amendment itself. As the nation's Attorney General, Bondi's intervention sent ripples through the courtroom. But before we unravel the story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe to stay ahead of the unfolding drama. Inside Chamber 4, the air was stretched tight with tension, the audience silent and transfixed. Clint Eastwood, now at the witness stand, held the unyielding presence of the drifter from a fistful of dollars. His tailored gray suit lent him a noble air, his eyes, steady and unblinking. Judge Christopher Baumer, seated high above, delivered his words with grave authority, his voice edged with formality. Mr. Eastwood, the court insists you respond with clarity regarding the film's substance. Your evasive answers are hindering these proceedings. Eastwood, in a tone low and deliberate, replied, "My film tells the truth. What more does the court require?" A murmur rolled through the gallery, but Whitaker, firm and cold, quelled the noise with a glance. "Mr. Eastwood, the court holds you in contempt for intentional defiance. Officers, place him under arrest." The metallic click of cuffs resounded through the chamber. All eyes widened, a screen legend, shackled. Reporters scribbled in haste, capturing history in the making. Eastwood, ever composed, stared ahead, his defiance unspoken. Then, from among the spectators, rose Pam Bondi, her charcoal suit sleek, her presence magnetic. "Your Honor," she said, voice measured yet resolute, "the Department of Justice strongly objects. This litigation stands in direct violation of constitutional protections for free speech." She held aloft an official brief. "This is a federal motion to halt all actions against Mr. Eastwood, effective immediately." A hush enveloped the room. Whitaker's expression faltered as he perused the filing. Murmurs of astonishment grew into scattered applause. Bondi met Whitaker's gaze with steel. Eastwood nodded faintly, a glint of appreciation in his eyes. A larger war had begun, one that pitted justice itself against the machinations of power. The sharp crack of Whitaker's gavel still rang in the air as Eastwood's arrest sent shockwaves across the courtroom. Outside, under a searing sun in Salem, crowds had gathered. Supporters held high-weathered posters of Eastwood from High Plains Drifter, a tribute not only to his cinematic legacy but also to his defiant spirit. But this courtroom thunderstorm had been brewing from a single source, a documentary. A passion project Eastwood had crafted quietly, and one now pushing him into the vortex of a legal firestorm. The film, directed and narrated by Eastwood, laid bare the tactics of a sprawling media empire accused of manipulating narratives and stifling dissent. With stark interviews and damning internal records, even the trailer had stirred public discourse like wildfire. Swiftly, the conglomerate hit back, filing suit and accusing Eastwood of disseminating falsehoods and inciting public unrest. They demanded access to every scrap of production material, a demand he flatly denied. "If they're after the truth," Eastwood told his inner circle, "they'll find it in theaters." His words turned the heat on Judge Whitaker, who, according to murmurs in legal corridors, bore a personal grudge. Years ago, one of Eastwood's films allegedly caricatured a corrupt official, a thinly veiled version of a close ally of Whitaker's. Throughout the trial, Whitaker's gaze barely masked a simmering disdain, as though he relished this chance to reprimand the man who dared to challenge the establishment. Outside the courthouse, Scott Eastwood addressed the crowd, his voice ringing with conviction. "My father has always stood on the side of truth. They won't gag him." On social media, waves of solidarity surged, from longtime admirers of Dirty Harry to young cinephiles inspired by Million Dollar Baby. The press fractured. Some labeled him a provocateur, others, a sentinel of liberty. Meanwhile, lead prosecutor Charles Smith stood confident, armed with an exhaustive case file alleging that the film was not only misleading but fueled by covert political agendas. With Whitaker at the helm, Samuels believed victory was his. But momentum shifted when Bondi made her move. At the Justice Department's headquarters in Portland, beneath cold fluorescent lights, a war room buzzed with energy. Stacks of legal documents towered over polished tables like sentinels of truth. Pam Bondi, calm yet intense, scanned the paperwork with precision. Despite the hour, her team pressed on with unwavering focus. To her right sat Matthew Johnson, a seasoned federal strategist with salt and pepper hair and a lifetime of courtroom grit. On her left, Sandra Jones, a rising star in constitutional law, sifted through digital files with lightning speed. They knew this case was no ordinary legal skirmish. It was an orchestrated strike against free speech. And Bondi had no intention of watching it unfold passively. She tapped her nails rhythmically against the table. Her voice was quiet, but firm. Whitaker's crossing a line. This isn't justice, it's theater with a political script. Reeves, flipping through exhibits, nodded grimly. We've got leads that the media conglomerate reached out to Whitaker's office before the suit was even filed. We dig deeper, we might uncover a conflict of interest. Marquez, her fingers flicking through confidential records, spoke next. I found a leaked report, an internal strategy memo, detailing their plan to smear Eastwood and delay the film's release. With over 10 years of experience as a lead prosecutor and as Oregon's former attorney general, Pam Bondi had developed a razor-sharp intuition for seeing through the veils of litigation. She had stood toe-to-toe with corporate titans and political heavyweights, prevailing every time by staying not just ahead of the curve, but beyond its reach. This case against Clint Eastwood pierced the very core of her convictions. Free expression wasn't just a constitutional clause to her, it was a sacred trust she had pledged to uphold. Years before, at a policy summit in Denver, she had crossed paths with Eastwood. His ability to transform unvarnished truth into art had left a lasting impression. Now, she stood firmly in his corner, not merely because of his stature, but because this lawsuit was a threat to the constitutional bedrock she had spent her life defending. The federal injunction has Whitaker on edge, Bondi said, eye sweeping the room. But Samuels will aim to paint the film as a politically charged operation. We must establish it as a standalone investigation. Reeves leaned in. Bring in Ashley, Eastwood's producer. She can attest to the transparency of the project. Marquez chimed in, and Mark Brown, the investigative reporter. He's got the unedited data that dismantles the misinformation allegations. Bondi gave a subtle nod, her gaze sharpened with focus. Good. We're going to make the courtroom a place where truth doesn't beg for permission. She rose and paced toward the window, staring out at the city cloaked in the hush of nightfall. Whitaker and the corporate machine believe they can twist the law into a weapon of silence, she murmured. But the Justice Department doesn't play spectator. We must anticipate every maneuver, from witness intimidation to probing Whitaker himself. Turning back, her voice gained steel. I want every file checked and rechecked by first light. This isn't just about Clint, it's about preserving every citizen's right to speak freely. Reeves immediately opened his laptop, beginning a draft for the federal counsel who would represent the Department of Justice at the hearing. Meanwhile, Marquez dived into the financial disclosures of the media conglomerate, scanning for links, hidden payments, quiet favors, that might connect them to Whitaker's chambers. Bondi returned to her seat, pen in hand, mapping out the tri-pronged strategy. Ashley would verify the film's internal integrity. Holt would validate the raw findings. And the DOJ would prepare to launch a formal probe into judicial bias, armed with the circumstantial evidence Marquez had uncovered. Yet Bondi also understood the deeper battlefield lay beyond the bench. If Whitaker was to be stopped from abusing his power again, it would require more than courtroom tactics. She instructed Reeves to notify the Office of the Inspector General, requesting an immediate review of Whitaker's recent judgments for signs of partiality and misuse of authority. If we establish a pattern of prejudice, she said, Whitaker won't just lose this case, he'll lose public trust. Marquez nodded briskly. I'll have a preliminary report on his rulings ready before sunrise. Bondi also considered the optics. The case had attracted national headlines. She tasked the DOJ's communications team with preparing a succinct, carefully worded press release underscoring the agency's unwavering commitment to civil liberties, omitting all reference to the investigation into Whitaker to avoid tipping their hand. "We need to win public confidence," she said. "But we can't let media noise derail our objective." As the night wore on, Bondi paused before leaving the war room. Her eyes rested briefly on a framed still from Unforgiven, Eastwood's weathered gaze piercing through dust and rain. She allowed herself a brief smile. This fight was just as unrelenting. But she was more than ready. When she stepped into the hallway, the overhead lights carved her silhouette onto the polished floor, the stance of a sentinel ready to guard truth. Morning broke over Courtroom 4 at the Portland Justice Center, golden light spilling through high-set windows and casting long shadows on the glossy wood. The gallery was full, an eager audience that watched every movement with the intensity of a final act. Clint Eastwood stood at the witness stand like a still from Gran Torino, composed and silent. His tailored suit exuded quiet strength, but his sharp gaze betrayed a storm of conviction. From the bench, Judge Christopher Baumer presided with an air of icy control. His tone was measured, but his words sliced clean. "The court calls upon the prosecution to present their arguments," he said, fingers resting on his desk, his eyes cool as they scanned the room. Charles Smith rose, dressed immaculately in a navy suit that seemed to reflect his practiced competence. He walked to the center of the courtroom, voice smooth as silk, but laced with the bite of precision. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Eastwood's film is not a work of artistic insight. It is a weapon of distortion, aimed at destabilizing a respected corporation." Gasps fluttered through the audience. Eastwood supporters shifted in their seats, some shaking their heads. A row of journalists hunched over notepads, pens racing. Samuels held aloft a thick file bearing the conglomerate's emblem. "We will demonstrate that this film is saturated with disinformation, and may have been covertly financed by partisan advocacy organizations." He called his first witness, Dr. Emily Davis, a stoic figure from a renowned media research institute. Dressed in professional austerity, she stepped forward and took the oath, her expression unreadable. Samuels wasted no time. "Dr. Voss, having analyzed the documentary, do its assertions align with publicly available data?" Her voice was dry, clinical. "No. The film grossly inflates the corporation's influence on media, citing figures that contradict verified reports. These distortions could significantly mislead the public." A fresh murmur stirred among the spectators. Kimberly Anderson, a young journalist near the front row, jotted notes feverishly, her brow furrowing with skepticism as she listened. Something in Voss's testimony struck her as rehearsed. Samuels leaned into the moment. "Dr. Voss, in your expert view, do you believe this film carries political undertones?" She hesitated, just a beat too long, then answered. "There's no direct proof, but the framing suggests an intentional narrative, likely appealing to certain advocacy sectors." Her words hit like flint on dry wood. The room tensed, dividing along silent lines. In the back row, an elderly fan whispered, "They're trying to bury him." Judge Whitaker struck his gavel with decisive force, his voice resonating with absolute command. "This court demands order. Prosecution, proceed." Charles Smith gestured toward a digital display, where a comparative graph lit up the screen, one side showing figures from Eastwood's documentary, the other reflecting data from official government sources. The documentary alleges that the conglomerate controls 70% of public information streams, he declared, his tone edged with triumph. Official statistics show that number is closer to 25%. This isn't an oversight, it's deliberate fabrication. The gallery grew hushed. Some spectators, once firmly supportive, now shifted in uncertainty. From the press bench, Betty Thompson scribbled rapidly, her inner monologue sharp. "Samuels is manipulating perception with figures, but Eastwood doesn't deal in fiction." Without changing his expression, Whitaker interjected. "Mr. Eastwood, the court requires a direct explanation of your data sources." Though the judge's tone remained composed, the question was barbed, clearly crafted to trap Eastwood in a bind. Eastwood leaned forward, his gravel-toned voice calm but charged with conviction. I made this film on the strength of what I believe to be true. My sources are individuals with nothing to gain, brave enough to speak without filters. Not polished bureaucratic reports. His response drew spontaneous applause from a few in the gallery, but the moment was short-lived. Order! Whitaker thundered, gavel crashing down. Mr. Eastwood, this court will not accept generalized statements. Specific answers, or further measures will be taken. A heavy silence fell. The tension clung to every breath, the courtroom now a crucible of pressure. Samuel seized the opening. I call Stephen White to the stand. A former senior employee of the conglomerate, Kendrick stepped forward, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding Eastwood's. Mr. Kendrick, Samuels began, did the film utilize information taken unlawfully from your former employer? Kendrick's voice trembled just slightly. Yes. The data was never meant for public release. It was taken without consent. The film not only misrepresents, it violates intellectual property law. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. A voice rang from the back. Liar! Whitaker's gavel struck harder than before. The court will not tolerate outbursts. Mr. Kendrick, continue. Now the media buzzed with urgency. Headlines blazed across news feeds. Eastwood accused of illegally sourcing data. Controversial film threatens Clint's legacy. But Pam Bondi, seated in the observer row, watched Samuels with the focus of a strategist at war. Her eyes tracked his every calculated move. She leaned toward Matthew Johnson and whispered. He's trying to corner Clint. We need Ashley and Holt ready, no delays. Reeves nodded, his jaw tight. Bondi had known from the moment she was briefed, this wasn't just about one man or one film. It was about stifling independent voices. The motion she'd filed earlier had shaken Whitaker, but she understood, neither he nor Samuels would yield easily. In response, she had tasked Sandra Jones with assembling a comprehensive dossier on the conglomerate's inner workings, using the damning internal memo previously uncovered. If we can prove manipulation behind the lawsuit, Bondi whispered, we flip the narrative. As Samuels wrapped up his argument, he cast a glance at Whitaker, a quiet nod passed between them. He believed the advantage was his. The court acknowledges the prosecution's case, Whitaker intoned. Defense, prepare to respond. But Bondi was already in motion. Her gaze, fierce and unwavering, was fixed on the next phase. She knew the DOJ was not simply defending a filmmaker, they were defending the very foundation of expression. This courtroom, heavy with heat and expectation, had become her front line. The air hung thick in the Portland courthouse following Samuel's final assertion. All eyes were now trained on the defense. At the front, Eastwood sat still as stone, his presence as resolute as a gunslinger from Pale Rider. Though pressure mounted, his eyes revealed no surrender. Judge Whitaker maintained his austere posture as he addressed the courtroom. The court now invites the defense to present its arguments. From the Department of Justice table, Sandra Jones rose. Her tailored suit echoed the same discipline as her preparation, and every movement projected calm assurance. Acting under Bondi's directive, Marquez had come armed, not just with facts, but with a strategy engineered to upend the prosecution's momentum. Your Honor, she began, her tone crisp, the prosecution paints the film as fiction disguised as fact, politically motivated and recklessly built. We are here to show, with evidence, that this film was composed transparently, legally, and without any external political influence. The shift in the room was subtle but immediate. Journalists leaned forward. Leah Carter, her pen momentarily stilled, sensed the coming turn. Marquez summoned the first witness. The defense calls Ashley, producer of the documentary. Ashley stepped forward with poise, her face composed, her step steady. She took the oath and sat, eyes fixed ahead. Ms. Ashley, Marquez asked, was the production process fully documented and legally compliant? Yes, Ashley answered, clear and unwavering. All funding originated from Mr. Eastwood's personal resources and vetted private backers. Every expenditure is logged and traceable. Marquez opened a file stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice and held it aloft. These are your accounting records? They are. Every payment, every vendor, every clearance is accounted for. Marquez turned to the bench. Your Honor, we move to enter these verified documents into the official record. Whitaker, unreadable as ever, gave a brief nod to the clerk. The court admits the records. Samuels rose, hand lifted in protest. Transparency in finances doesn't equate to truth in content. But Marquez was ready. A flicker of a smile touched her lips. We'll address that momentarily. Marquez called her second witness, Mark Brown, the investigative journalist whose findings formed the backbone of Eastwood's documentary. Holt stepped into the spotlight with composed certainty. Tall, spare in build, with eyes sharp as broken glass, he took the stand as if he had waited for this moment, not with arrogance, but conviction. Mr. Holt, Marquez began, voice measured, can you explain the origin of the data used in Mr. Eastwood's film? Holt nodded slightly, then answered, his voice resonant and steady. All data came from public archives, legally obtained internal reports, and carefully vetted interviews. Every figure, every claim, was triple verified against independent sources. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. Marquez lifted a binder stacked with color-coded pages. These documents, your originals, demonstrate how the conglomerate manipulated public narratives to a degree far beyond what's reflected in official reports. Is that correct? Exactly, Holt affirmed. What the public sees is the sanitized version. What we found was something else entirely. In the back row, a supporter whispered. That's Eastwood for you, always striking straight at the gut of the lie. Judge Whitaker's gavel fell again. This courtroom demands decorum. Witness, continue. Marquez advanced. Mr. Holt, were any political organizations involved in funding or shaping your investigation? Holt answered without hesitation. None. I worked independently. And Mr. Eastwood never once interfered. He protected the integrity of the process. His words cut through the prosecution's theory like a blade through gauze. Samuels, visibly unsettled, stood for the cross-examination. Mr. Holt, he began, trying to steady his voice, how can we be sure your findings weren't framed to support Mr. Eastwood's personal agenda? Holt leaned forward, unblinking. The truth doesn't bend to agendas. Every source I used is publicly available. Anyone who doubts the data is welcome to review it themselves. A soft wave of chuckles escaped from the gallery. Samuels, caught off balance, quickly ended the line of questioning. But Marquez wasn't finished. She approached the defense table, retrieving a fresh stack of printed emails, communications unearthed through Matthew Johnson probe, conducted in tandem with the Department of Justice's Intelligence Division. Turning to the judge, her voice echoed with sharp resolve. Your Honor, the DOJ has obtained credible evidence that the conglomerate behind this lawsuit sought to sabotage Mr. Eastwood's reputation before his film was even released. She raised the top page and read aloud. Quote, stop Eastwood at all costs. If that fails, destroy his name. The gallery gasped, tension bursting like a dam. Journalists snapped to attention, pens racing. Leah Carter, her eyes wide, scribbled furiously. DOJ uncovers damning plot, this changes everything. Whitaker, momentarily thrown, struck his gavel with force. Order. The court will review the document's authenticity. Defense may proceed. Samuels, rattled and red-faced, rose to object. We request time to verify this material's origin. Whitaker cut in, his tone curt. The court will follow protocol. Objection noted. With the tide turning, Marquez moved for the final blow. We call Dr. Margaret Clark, expert in constitutional law and advisor to the Department of Justice. Dr. Emily, poised and articulate, approached the stand. After the oath, Marquez posed the final question. Dr. Sanderson, does the creation and public release of this film, despite its controversial subject, violate any constitutional statutes? The expert's voice rang like a verdict. Absolutely not. The First Amendment protects speech, especially when it challenges institutions. The film is legal and protected. Samuels clenched his pen, his composure fraying. From the gallery, Bondi met Eastwood's eyes. He offered a slight, deliberate nod, not of thanks, but solidarity. She turned to Reeves and whispered. Marquez landed the blow. Now we fast-track the Whitaker investigation. The internal emails didn't just erode Samuel's argument, they exposed Whitaker's impartiality to a dangerous degree. The DOJ's investigation, now fully activated, was combing through his recent rulings, flagging patterns of bias. The air inside the courtroom buzzed like the final act of a symphony, taut with crescendo. After Marquez's testimony, all eyes shifted once more, from the defense table, to the bench, to the front row where Bondi sat composed, her presence that of a tactician in control of every angle. Eastwood remained impassive, but the unrelenting gaze he cast forward recalled his steel-eyed stare and hang high, weathered by the storm, unbroken by its fury. From his elevated seat, Judge Christopher Baumer tried to maintain the solemnity of a federal magistrate. But behind the veneer of control, tension coiled. His voice, when it came, was deliberate. The prosecution may continue its argument. Samuels rose once more, his shoulders stiffer, his suit no longer crisp. Still, he clung to the remnants of his case. Your Honor, he began, despite the defense's claim to transparency, we have reason to believe this film was backed by politically extreme entities. We request that Mr. Eastwood provide a full list of all donors for verification. Gasps swept through the gallery again. The question landed like frost on glass, sharp, sudden, and cracking. Leila Carter's pen danced across her notepad. Samuel's last card, a funding trap? Whitaker, his voice neutral but subtly edged, addressed Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, the court requests clarification. Will you disclose all financial backers associated with this production? Though the question was framed with judicial decorum, it reeked of strategy, an attempt to box Eastwood into accusations of concealed political funding. But Eastwood remained composed. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice low, steady, and full of quiet fire. This film was made with my own money, and contributions from people who believe in truth, not politics. No agendas. No parties. Just me, and a story that needed telling. The room held its breath. In that silence, Eastwood's words reverberated, not just across the courtroom, but across a nation watching from behind screens and headlines, awaiting the next chapter in a battle between justice and silencing truth. Eastwood's words hung in the air like the final note of a hymn, solemn, clear, immovable. Scattered applause rose from the gallery, a ripple of support breaking the courtroom's tense silence. But Judge Whitaker struck his gavel like a thunderclap. The court does not entertain emotional statements. Mr. Eastwood, provide precise information or further measures will be considered. The applause faded instantly. A hush fell over the room, thick with the weight of scrutiny. Sandra Jones rose once more, her DOJ badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. Her gaze didn't flinch. Your Honor, she said, voice ringing like a bell through still air, this line of questioning is immaterial and speculative. The prosecution has offered no evidence of illicit funding. The Department of Justice objects. Whitaker, impassive, replied with formal detachment. Objection overruled. The court retains authority to examine all aspects relevant to potential motive. Though he cloaked his words in neutrality, something in his insistence felt strained, a tension that did not go unnoticed. From the press row, Leila Carter scribbled furiously in her notepad, her mind racing. Whitaker's overreach is becoming a spectacle. This isn't justice, it's a crusade. Samuels, emboldened by the ruling, struck again. We call Ashley back to the stand. Ashley, the film's producer, resumed her seat on the witness stand, calm and composed. Ms. Ashley, Samuels began, the corners of his tone sharpened by suspicion, Can you say with absolute certainty that no entity, not even indirectly, influenced the film's message? Ashley didn't blink. With absolute certainty. Every decision was made solely by Mr. Eastwood and our team. No group, no organization dictated the narrative. For the first time, Whitaker broke his restrained posture, leaning forward. Miss Ashley, he said, voice level but suggestive, doesn't the film's deliberate focus on one corporation suggest political targeting? A stir swept through the room. His question wasn't just inappropriate, it was provocative. Marquez was on her feet before the final syllable dropped. Objection, Your Honor. That question exceeds the scope of this trial. It's speculative and prejudicial. We ask that it be withdrawn. Whitaker's response came like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Objection overruled. The witness will answer. A chill rippled through the chamber. The illusion of judicial neutrality was cracking. A spectator whispered. They're trying to break him, but Eastwood's never folded. From her seat in the gallery, Pam Bondi sat silent and sharp-eyed. She leaned toward Matthew Johnson, her voice like the calm before a storm. Whitaker's letting it slip. He's no longer just biased, he's exposed. Move fast on the Inspector General's review. Bondi had already directed Reeves and DOJ investigators to widen their net, cross-referencing Whitaker's recent case history with financial footprints tied to the conglomerate. The internal emails introduced earlier by Marquez hinted at more than collusion, they whispered complicity. Later that afternoon, in a temporary DOJ command center just blocks from the courthouse, Bondi gathered her core team. The air buzzed with urgency. Whitaker is no longer adjudicating. He's orchestrating, she said, her voice low but commanding. We need undeniable proof of misconduct. Reeves replied, flipping through a file. The Inspector General flagged two of Whitaker's previous rulings, same conglomerate, same kind of procedural irregularities. We'll have a preliminary report within 24 hours. Marquez glanced up from her laptop. I'm tracing the conglomerate's donations and legal expenditures. If there's even a shadow of a transaction linked to Whitaker's affiliates, we'll find it. Bondi's eyes narrowed. This isn't just about defending Eastwood anymore. It's about preserving the judiciary's integrity. If Whitaker crossed the line, we'll be the ones to hold him accountable. As she returned to the courtroom, she caught Eastwood's gaze. He gave her a barely perceptible nod, a shared recognition of the stakes, and of the quiet war they were waging. Back in courtroom 4, Whitaker resumed his seat in the judge's chair, robed, composed, but not unshaken. What had once seemed like an impenetrable aura of authority now carried the faint but growing tremble of uncertainty. The gallery, no longer tense but curiously expectant, seemed to sense what was coming. Days of fierce argument, meticulous testimony, and the unflinching resolve of the Department of Justice had narrowed the path forward. At the defense table, Clint Eastwood sat with a serenity reminiscent of his character in The Bridges of Madison County, calm not from comfort, but from hard-earned truth. He had endured storms before. This one, too, would pass. Whitaker lifted his gavel, then lowered it gently. His voice remained steady, but its authority was waning. The court has now reviewed all evidence, witness testimony, and legal arguments regarding allegations of misinformation and politically motivated funding. He paused. The room inhaled. The prosecution has failed to provide sufficient, compelling evidence to substantiate its claims. The words swept through the courtroom like a breeze through dry grass. An elderly woman clutched her trial program to her chest and whispered. Truth wins. From the press row, Leila Carter's pen raced, her fingers trembling slightly. Eastwood, not just cleared, but vindicated. Whitaker, now clearly reciting words he had hoped not to speak, continued. Therefore, the court finds no basis for contempt of court or any further action against Mr. Eastwood. All charges related to the film are hereby dismissed. The courtroom exploded, a spontaneous eruption of applause, cheers, and sighs of deliverance. Whitaker struck the gavel again, harder this time. Order. This courtroom demands order. But no one was listening. The wave of emotion was too strong, not just victory, but justice reasserted. Samuels remained seated, his face strained, fingers clenched around pages that no longer held meaning. He had gambled everything on silencing a voice, and lost. Bondi turned to Matthew Johnson and gave the faintest nod. Her expression betrayed no glee, only purpose fulfilled. The Department of Justice, under her guidance, had not simply shielded Eastwood. They had delivered a message that echoed far beyond the oak-paneled walls of the courthouse. Free speech does not kneel to fear, nor does it crumble under political weight. Not while justice has breath, and defenders like Pam Bondi are ready to fight for it. Yet this victory was not won in the courtroom alone. Behind the scenes, beyond the clamor of applause and the rhythm of gavels, Pam Bondi's final maneuver had already been set in motion. The federal investigation, quietly commissioned days earlier through the Office of the Inspector General, had yielded its preliminary findings. 3 recent rulings issued by Judge Christopher Baumer displayed unmistakable signs of bias. More damning still, investigators uncovered indirect ties between Whitaker's chambers and allies of the suing conglomerate. Though the findings were never publicly broadcast, the report was hand-delivered to the Federal Judicial Oversight Committee, igniting a quiet but inescapable reckoning. 1 week after the trial's conclusion, a subdued announcement emerged: Whitaker was stepping down, citing completion of term and personal reflection. But those in the legal world understood the truth. He hadn't resigned. He'd been cornered. The press, galvanized by the trial's drama and moral clarity, launched a wave of coverage. Headlines flared across every major outlet. Eastwood vindicated, film of truth prevails, and DOJ defends the First Amendment. Leah Carter, the young journalist whose pen had followed every turn of the story, published a long-form feature. In it, she described Eastwood as the keeper of truth's flame, and Bondi as the unwavering strategist who reminded the nation what justice looks like. On social media, the hashtag #StandWithEastwood surged, no longer just a slogan, it became a digital monument to resilience. As the final spectators drifted from the courthouse, Scott Eastwood stood in the corridor, waiting for his father. When they embraced, his voice wavered. "You did it, Dad." Clint, his eyes crinkling with that familiar glint, replied with quiet certainty. "Not me, the ones who still believe in truth." In a quieter corner of the hallway, Pam Bondi stepped forward. Her eyes met Eastwood's, their mutual respect needing no grand expression. "You turned this fight into something unforgettable," Eastwood said, his voice grave and grateful. Bondi gave a restrained smile. "I only did my job. But you gave us something worth standing for." Their handshake, firm and solemn, felt less like a conclusion and more like an oath, warriors acknowledging the honor of shared battle. Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker exited through a side door, lips sealed, head bowed, reporters ignored. His resignation, dressed in diplomatic phrasing, stood as a silent monument to Bondi's precision, and a warning to those who might seek to bend justice in the shadows. Bondi had done more than shield Eastwood, she had issued a clear message to the judiciary. Power unchecked would not go unnoticed. As the courtroom doors finally closed, what remained wasn't just the echo of a legal triumph, it was the quiet reaffirmation of a timeless belief. Truth, when guarded by those willing to fight for it, will always find its way to light. Under the endless sky of a sun-baked Nevada plain, Clint Eastwood stood alone, the last of the day's light burnishing his weathered face in amber hues. At 94, his silhouette against the horizon was still unmistakable, a figure not of age, but of endurance. In the distance, his film crew wrapped the final scene, packing up cables and lenses. But Eastwood lingered, staring beyond the camera's frame, toward a future shaped by stories still waiting to be told. The film, freed by its legal triumph, was now showing across the globe, not just as a cinematic piece, but as a cultural spark igniting impassioned dialogue on speech and censorship. In Washington, in a modest office at the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi sat reviewing a new civil liberties report, her gaze focused, her expression calm. Under her stewardship, the DOJ had not only defended Eastwood, they had paved a path for new policies, reinforcing constitutional protections that too often lay at risk. When colleagues suggested a press conference to celebrate the legal victory, Bondi simply replied, "Justice doesn't need applause. Our job was to protect, not to parade." To her, the lawsuit was a case study, a reminder that a just system requires not only good laws, but good people willing to wield them wisely. Across the country, theaters buzzed with viewers, from veterans of Unforgiven to young cinephiles captivated by a man who had refused to be silenced. The film had become more than a documentary. It had become a declaration. Online, the hashtag Eastwood Forever surged anew, often accompanied by a still image of him standing in that golden Nevada dusk, gaze unwavering. In her final column, Betty Thompson called Eastwood the beacon of truth, and Bondi the wind that carried justice forward. On set, Scott Eastwood joined his father, watching the last of the crew disperse into the deepening twilight. "You didn't just win, Dad," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You turned this fight into a legend." Clint, his voice quiet and wry, replied, "The legend isn't me, it's anyone who still believes in doing what's right." His words carried across the dry field like a breeze through wheat, simple, but stirring. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Clint Eastwood turned toward the camera once more, his gaze holding the weight of decades, and the light of conviction that doesn't fade. The battle, the film, and the trial had all become more than moments. They were a testament to a life lived unflinchingly, and to a truth defended with grace, grit, and quiet fire. In Washington, Bondi kept working, never slowing, ensuring that the Department of Justice remained not a bureaucratic fortress, but a guardian of freedom. And in the hearts of those who watched it all unfold, from courtrooms to living rooms, the flame that Eastwood carried still burned. The film unearthed the deliberate manipulation of public perception by a sprawling media conglomerate, a revelation that struck a chord in today's America, where the battle over truth and misinformation plays out daily in headlines, hashtags, and living rooms. Judge Christopher Baumer's order to arrest Clint Eastwood, along with his pointed accusations of political funding, echoed real-world efforts to muzzle independent voices, much like lawsuits aimed at silencing journalists, whistleblowers, or citizens who dare to speak truth to power. But this wasn't just fiction wrapped in legal drama. Pam Bondi, in her role as Attorney General, intervened with decisive purpose, filing a federal motion, launching a judicial probe, and reminding the nation what the justice system looks like when wielded by those who honor the Constitution, not their careers. The internal emails revealed by Sandra Jones didn't just shift the courtroom, they illuminated a greater truth, that facts, when pursued with tenacity and strategy, can still cut through the noise of manipulation. Just like today's most courageous investigative journalists, Marquez followed the trail and found the fire behind the smoke. In the end, Eastwood's vindication and the film's wide release were more than personal triumphs. They were a reflection of something enduring. The American ideal that truth and liberty are not privileges granted by power, but rights earned and defended by those brave enough to stand firm. The lesson? In the real world, where opinion often shouts louder than principle, and power flexes more easily than fairness, remember what Eastwood and Bondi showed us. Hold the line. Like Eastwood, refuse to be bullied into silence. Like Bondi, use the system not for self-preservation, but for justice. When others fold under pressure, respond with evidence, poise, and quiet force. Whether in the workplace, in your community, or on the broader stage of public discourse, truth, when shielded with clarity and conviction, will always make its way through. Like Eastwood's flame in the Nevada dusk, it may flicker, but it will never be extinguished.